The morning Anna Bishop buried her father, she also learned that the bank owned more of the Bishop Ranch than she did, and she made a vow standing over that fresh grave that no man in a starched collar would ever put his name on this land while she still had breath in her body. It was the spring of 1878, in the high grass country of the Wyoming Territory, where the wind came down off the Bighorn Mountains and combed through the sagebrush like a hand through a woman's hair. The Bishop Ranch sat in a wide green bowl of land along Crooked Creek, 40 miles from the nearest town of any size, a town called Silver Fork that had grown up around a stage stop and an assay office and had since sprouted a bank, a mercantile, a church, and 2 saloons that never seemed to close. Anna's father, Thomas Bishop, had come out from Ohio in 1861 with nothing but a wagon, a rifle, and a young wife who did not survive her second winter on the plains. He had built the ranch up from nothing, through Indian troubles and blizzards and one terrible year of drought that had nearly broken him, and he had done it all with the stubborn, quiet faith that the land would provide if a man was willing to bleed for it. Anna had bled for it too. She was 24 years old that spring, with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, and she had spent every one of those 24 years learning the ranch the way other girls learned needlework. She could rope a calf, ride a green horse, and shoot a rattlesnake off a fence post without flinching. What she could not do, as she stood in the office of the Silver Fork Trust and Savings Bank 3 days after the funeral, was make the numbers in the ledger book add up to anything but ruin. "Miss Bishop," said the banker, a narrow man named Elias Crane with pale hands and a mustache waxed to 2 sharp points, "I understand your grief, truly I do. Your father was a respected man in this county, but respect does not pay a note that is 4 months past due." "I know what is owed," Anna said. Her voice did not shake, though her hands, folded in her lap, were white at the knuckles. "I am asking for time. The herd is strong this year. Come fall roundup, I will have the money." Crane steepled his fingers on the desk between them. Behind him, through the window, Anna could see the dusty width of Main Street, the hitching posts, a boy driving a hog down the center of the road with a switch. 4 months, Miss Bishop, is a great deal of time already given. The bank has been more than patient on account of your father's long standing here, but I have my own obligations to the men who hold shares in this institution. If the note is not satisfied by the 1st of September, the bank will have no choice but to foreclose and sell the property to recover its investment. You would put a woman out of her home. "I would recover money that is rightfully owed," Crane said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, only the flat patience of a man who had said such things many times before and expected to say them many times again. "Perhaps you might consider selling now, before the debt grows larger. There are buyers who would treat you fairly. Mr. Sorrel, for one, has expressed interest in the water rights along Crooked Creek." Anna's stomach turned at the mention of Wallace Sorrel, who ran the biggest spread in the valley and had been trying to buy out the smaller ranches along the creek for 3 years, ever since he had realized that whoever controlled the water controlled everything downstream of it. She had heard stories about how Sorrel's men handled negotiations with ranchers who did not wish to sell, cut fences, poisoned wells. A barn burned in the night with no one ever caught for it. She stood up from the chair, smoothing her black mourning skirt with hands that had stopped trembling somewhere in the last minute, replaced by something harder and colder. "I won't let this ranch die with me," she said. "My father built that place with his own 2 hands. I intend to keep it standing with mine. You'll have your money by September, Mr. Crane, every dollar of it, and not 1 acre of Bishop land will pass to Wallace Sorrel or to this bank. You may tell your shareholders that." Crane looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression might have been respect or might have been pity, though Anna could not tell which and did not much care. "I hope you are right, Miss Bishop. I truly do. But hope has never yet paid a mortgage." She left the bank with her back straight and her chin level, the way her father had taught her to sit a horse through a hailstorm, and she did not let the tears come until she was 3 miles out of town, alone on the wagon road, with nothing but the meadowlarks to hear her. Raymond Boone rode into the Bishop yard 2 weeks later, on a bay gelding with a Texas brand still faintly visible beneath a newer one, looking for work and finding, instead, a ranch that had nearly none of the two things a ranch needed most: money and hands. He was 30 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had spent a decade wrestling cattle and breaking horses, with sun-weathered skin, and eyes the deep brown of creek water in shadow. He had come up from the Texas Panhandle after the winter of 76-77, the one the old-timers were already calling the Great Die-Up, when 100,000 head of cattle had frozen standing in the drifts and half the outfit south of the Red River had gone under. Raymond had ridden for the /7 outfit near Tascosa until the owner sold out to a syndicate from Chicago that brought in its own foreman and let half the old hands go, Raymond among them. He had drifted north since then, chasing rumors of work, sleeping under the stars more nights than not, with everything he owned tied behind his saddle in a war bag that had seen better years. Anna was mending a fence along the north pasture when she saw him coming, a dark shape against the gold grass, moving at an easy walk that told her he was not a man in any particular hurry, or else was smart enough not to spook a rancher's dogs by coming on fast and unannounced. She set down her fencing pliers and picked up the rifle she kept leaned against a post, not raising it, only letting her hand rest near it, the way a woman alone on isolated land learns to do without even thinking on it. "Afternoon," Raymond called, when he was close enough that shouting was not required but far enough that he was clearly not attempting to crowd her. He touched the brim of his hat. "Name's Raymond Boone. I'm looking for the owner of this outfit." "You're looking at her," Anna said. "Anna Bishop. What is it you want, Mr. Boone?" If he was surprised to find a woman running the place alone, he did not show it on his face, which Anna noted and filed away as a point in his favor, small as it was. Most men, when they learned she ran the ranch by herself, looked at her the way they might look at a dog walking on its hind legs, some mixture of amusement and disbelief that she found more tiring than any day's physical labor. "Work, ma'am, if you've got it. I've punched cattle 11 years, broke horses for the /7 down in Texas, and I can mend fence, doctor a sick animal, and cook a meal that won't kill a man, though I won't promise it'll delight him either." He said this last with the faint trace of a smile, and Anna found herself, despite the black mourning band still tied around her sleeve, almost smiling back. "I can't pay much," she said honestly, because there seemed little point in pretending otherwise. $10 a month and board, and I won't lie to you and tell you it's steady beyond the 1st of September. The bank holds a note on this land, and if I can't pay it by then, there may be no ranch left to work." Raymond looked past her, out over the pasture, at the cattle scattered dark red and white against the green, at the mountain standing blue and serrated along the western edge of the world, at the creek running silver through the willows. It was, Anna thought, watching his face, a look she recognized, because she had felt the same pull in her own chest every single day of her life. Some men saw land and thought only of what it could be turned into. Others saw it and simply wanted to belong to it. $10 is fine," he said. "I've worked for less and slept worse. When do you want me to start?" "Tomorrow before sunup," Anna said. "There's a bunkhouse out past the barn. It's empty since my last 2 hands quit last month. Didn't think a woman running things alone was worth their time anymore once my father passed." "Their loss," Raymond said simply, and swung down off the bay to shake her hand, his grip firm and calloused and warm, and something in that plain handshake settled into Anna's chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples she did not yet understand and was not in that moment looking for at all. The weeks that followed were the hardest, and though Anna would not have admitted it aloud to another living soul, some of the most alive she had felt since her father's passing. Raymond Boone worked like a man who understood that his wages depended on more than dollars, mending fence line after fence line, riding out at dawn to check the herd, doctoring a heifer that had gotten into locoweed and nearly died of it, staying up 3 nights running to nurse a colt through a bout of colic that would have killed the animal without constant attention. He did not talk much in those early weeks, beyond what the work required, and Anna respected that, because she was not much of a talker herself, not since her father died and left her alone with only the wind and the cattle and the endless calculations of debt and interest for company. But in the evenings, after supper, when the light went long and gold across the valley and the day's chores were done, they had begun to sit on the porch steps together, not speaking of anything important, simply watching the sun go down behind the mountains, and Anna found that she looked forward to those quiet minutes more than she looked forward to almost anything else in her days. It was on one such evening in the middle of June, with the meadowlarks calling from the fence posts and a jackrabbit bounding across the yard in long, unhurried leaps, that Raymond finally asked her about the bank. "You said something that first day about a note come due in September," he said, turning his hat slowly in his hands. "I don't mean to pry into your business, Miss Bishop, but I've been looking at your herd and looking at your grass, and I don't rightly see how the numbers work out favorable for you, not without some kind of miracle." Anna was quiet for a long moment, watching the light fade over Crooked Creek. Then, because there was something about Raymond Boone that made her want to speak plainly, something steady and unhurried in him that made her trust her own voice around him in a way she had not trusted it around any man since her father died, she told him everything. She told him about the note her father had taken out 3 years back, when a bad winter had killed off nearly a third of the herd, and there had been no choice but to borrow against the land itself to buy breeding stock and see the ranch through. She told him about the slow climb back, cattle prices finally beginning to recover after the disaster of the die-up further south, about how close they had come, this past winter, to finally getting ahead of the debt, and about how her father's heart had simply stopped one morning in March, over his coffee, with no warning at all, leaving her alone with a debt of $1,100 and a deadline of September the 1st. $1,100, Raymond said slowly. "That's a fair piece of money. It is at that. I've got maybe 300 head I could drive to market if I had hands enough to make the drive and a buyer willing to give a fair price. Beef's been low this spring on account of the eastern markets still recovering from the die-up glutting things out west, but if I could get them to the railhead at Cheyenne before the fall herds all come in and drive the price down further, I might make enough. Might. It's a long shot, Mr. Boone, and I know it." "Raymond," he said. "You can call me Raymond. Seems foolish to stand on formality with a man who's mucked out your barn every morning for a month." Anna felt warmth rise in her cheeks, unbidden, and was grateful for the fading light that hid it. "Raymond, then, and you may call me Anna, I suppose, under the circumstances." "Anna." He said her name carefully like he was testing the weight of it, and something in the way he said it made her chest go tight and strange. "Well, Anna, I've made a cattle drive or two in my time, and I know the Cheyenne Trail well enough. If you're set on driving that herd to market, you'll need more hands than just the two of us. But it can be done. I've seen smaller outfits than yours pull off bigger drives with worse odds. You'd help me. Even though your wages might dry up along with everything else if I fail." Raymond looked at her then, and there was something in his brown eyes, steady and warm in the dusk light, that made Anna's breath catch in a way she did not fully understand and was not entirely certain she wanted to understand. Not yet. Not with her father barely 3 months in the ground and the whole weight of the ranch resting on her shoulders. "I didn't ride onto this place looking for an easy job, Anna," he said quietly. "I rode on looking for something worth doing. Seems to me helping a woman keep the ranch her father built with his own hands, against a bank that just as soon see her fail so they can sell the water rights to the highest bidder, that's about as worth doing as anything I've come across in a long while." They shook on it, there on the porch steps in the fading light, though it was not quite like their first handshake, weeks before. This one lingered a moment longer than it needed to, and when Raymond finally let go of her hand, Anna found herself missing the warmth of it more than she was willing to say. The drive to Cheyenne would require more than the two of them, and so word went out through Silver Fork that the Bishop Ranch was hiring hands for a cattle drive, wages to be paid on delivery of the herd, a proposition that scared off some men but drew in others who had nothing better to do and no particular fear of hard work for uncertain pay. By the first week of July, Anna had assembled a crew of 6, counting herself and Raymond. 2 young cowboys named Jed Whitfield and Otis Cray, who had drifted up from the Nebraska Panhandle looking for outfit work. A grizzled old trail hand called Cookie Malone, who had ridden the Kishom Trail more times than he could accurately count, and who agreed to sign on as camp cook in exchange for a share of the profit. And a quiet Crow man named Walks with Thunder, who had worked cattle for outfits up and down the territory, and who Raymond had met years back on a drive out of Montana, and trusted more than most white men he had ever ridden with. Wallace Sorrel heard about the drive, of course. In a country as thinly settled as the valley around Silver Fork, there were few secrets that stayed secret for long, and Sorrel had eyes and ears in every saloon and mercantile between the Bishop Ranch and the bank. He rode out to the ranch himself on a hot afternoon in the middle of July, dressed in a fine gray suit, entirely unsuited to riding a horse across open range, with 2 of his men trailing behind him at a respectful distance, and found Anna in the corral working a young mare that had never been saddled. "Miss Bishop," Sorrel said, dismounting and removing his hat with an exaggerated courtesy that did nothing to disguise the calculation in his pale eyes. "I hear you're planning a drive to Cheyenne, ambitious for an outfit your size." "We manage," Anna said, not looking up from the mare, letting the animal feel the saddle blanket settle over her back for the first time. "I'll be direct with you, since I understand directness is something you appreciate. I know about the note. Crane's an old friend of mine, and bankers do talk, especially to men who hold shares in their institution. $1,100 is a great deal to raise from 300 head of cattle at current market prices, particularly if anything at all goes wrong on the trail. And things do go wrong on the trail, Miss Bishop. Rivers flood. Cattle stampede. Rustlers work that stretch of country between here and the railhead more than the newspapers care to report." "Is that a threat, Mr. Sorrel, or merely an observation?" Sorrel smiled, an expression that did not reach his pale eyes at all. "An observation, purely. I am simply a businessman who sees an opportunity that might benefit us both. I will offer you $1,400, cash in hand, for the ranch, water rights included, enough to clear your father's debt entirely and leave you with money besides to start fresh somewhere less demanding of a woman alone. You could go east, buy a fine house in Cheyenne or Denver, live comfortably without the burden of this place hanging over you." Anna finally turned to face him fully, and there was something in her gray eyes, something of the same steel that had stood over her father's grave and made her vow what she vowed, that made even Wallace Sorrel take an involuntary step backward. "This is not a burden, Mr. Sorrel. This is my home. My father bled for this land, and I intend to keep it, water rights and all, and drive that herd to Cheyenne myself if I have to do it with nothing but my own 2 hands and a rope. You may tell your friend Mr. Crane that the note will be paid in full by September the 1st, and that Bishop land is not now, nor will it ever be, for sale." Sorrel's smile faded into something colder. "A pity," he said. "The trail to Cheyenne can be a dangerous place for a small outfit, Miss Bishop. I would think carefully on your decision. Not everyone who sets out on that trail arrives at the other end of it whole." He mounted his horse and rode off with his 2 men trailing behind, and Anna stood in the corral with her heart pounding, not from fear exactly, but from a fury so pure and clean it nearly took her breath away. Raymond had watched the entire exchange from the barn door, close enough to hear most of it, and when Sorrel was well clear of the yard, he crossed to where Anna stood, his jaw tight. "That man just threatened you," he said, "plain as day. I heard the same thing you did." Anna's hands were shaking now that the confrontation was over, the fury giving way to something more like fear. He wants the water rights bad enough to make trouble for us on the trail. I don't doubt it. Then we'll be ready for trouble, Raymond said, and the quiet certainty in his voice did more to settle Anna's nerves than any amount of reassurance might have. I've dealt with rustlers before, Anna. Sorrel's men aren't the first hard cases I've come across on a drive, and they won't be the last. We'll post a night watch the whole way to Cheyenne, and we'll keep our wits about us. I won't let anything happen to this herd, not while I'm riding for it. He said it with such simple conviction, standing there in the July heat with dust on his boots and sweat darkening the collar of his shirt, that Anna felt something shift inside her chest, some wall she had built up brick by brick since her father's death, since the bank, since the endless calculations of debt and survival that had consumed every waking hour of the past 4 months. She looked up at Raymond Boone, at the steady brown of his eyes and the strong line of his jaw, and for the first time since March, she let herself feel something other than grief and worry and fear. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for staying, for all of it." "Wasn't going anywhere," Raymond said, and the way he looked at her then made her wonder, not for the first time, whether he meant that only about the ranch. The herd moved out from the Bishop Ranch on the 15th of July. 312 head of Longhorn Cross cattle strung out in a long, dusty column under a sky so blue, and vast it seemed to Anna, riding drag at the back of the herd to keep the stragglers moving, like the whole of creation had opened up above her. Raymond rode point, out front, reading the land for water and grass, while Walkswith Thunder and Jed Whitfield Road swing along the sides, and Otis Cray helped Cookie Malone manage the chuck wagon, which rattled along behind the herd loaded with beans and salt pork and flour, and the coffee that would keep them all upright through the long days and longer nights ahead. The days fell into a rhythm that Anna had heard described by old trail hands, but never experienced herself. Up before dawn to the smell of Cookie's coffee, and the sound of cattle already beginning to stir and low in the gray light, then the long push through the heat of the day, pausing at noon to let the herd graze and water if a creek was handy, then pushing on again until the light began to fail, and it was time to make camp, hobble the horses, post the night watch, and fall into an exhausted sleep beneath a sky thick with more stars than Anna had ever quite noticed from the porch of her own home. It was hard, filthy, exhausting work, and Anna found that she loved it more than she had expected to. Loved the burn in her legs from long days in the saddle, the ache in her shoulders from roping strays back into the herd, the deep satisfaction of watching the cattle move steady and calm beneath a competent hand. She loved, too, though she was slower to admit this even to herself, the sight of Raymond Boone silhouetted against the sunset each evening as he rode the perimeter of the herd one last time before full dark, checking for gaps in the makeshift rope corral, making certain every animal was accounted for before he would allow himself to rest. On the 6th night out, camped along a bend of the Platte River with the herd bedded down peaceful in the cool evening air, Anna could not sleep, her mind turning over the numbers again as it always did, the distance yet to cover, the days remaining before the bank's deadline, the price of beef at the railhead which might have shifted in either direction in the weeks since they'd last had word from Cheyenne. She left her bedroll quietly and walked to the edge of the firelight, where Raymond sat alone on night watch, his rifle across his knees, watching the dark shapes of the cattle against the paler dark of the prairie beyond. "Can't sleep?" he asked, without turning. "Too much arithmetic in my head." Anna settled down beside him on the cool grass, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him even in the July night air. "I keep thinking about what happens if we're short, even by a little. What happens if the price has dropped since we last heard, or if we lose cattle on the trail, or if Sorrel's men do something worse than talk." Raymond was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was low and careful, the voice of a man weighing his words before he offered them. "My daddy used to say worry was a debt you paid on a loan you never took out. I've turned that over in my head 1,000 times since he died, and I still don't know if it's wisdom or just something a tired man says to a tired boy to get him to sleep. But I do know this, Anna. I've ridden a lot of miles with a lot of outfits, and I've never once seen a herd this well handled, run by a rancher this determined, fail to reach where it was going. Whatever happens at that railhead, you'll have done everything a person could do. That has to count for something. Does it, though? Count for something, I mean, if the ranch is lost anyway. Raymond turned to look at her then, and in the firelight his eyes were dark and warm and very steady. It counts to me, he said quietly. It counts to me more than I know how to say plain, Anna Bishop, watching you these past weeks. You've got more grit than any man I ever punched cattle with, and a good deal more heart besides. Whatever happens with the bank, that ranch has already got a piece of you in it that no banker's ledger will ever be able to take away. Anna felt her throat tighten, and she was grateful for the darkness that hid the sudden brightness in her eyes. She had not realized until that moment, sitting beside Raymond Boone under a sky full of stars with the smell of wood smoke and cattle and prairie grass all around them, how much she had needed to hear something like that. How long she had been carrying the weight of her father's ranch and her father's debt and her father's memory entirely alone. "Raymond," she said softly, and he turned to her again, and something in the way their eyes met across the small distance between them made the rest of the words catch in her throat. He reached out slowly and brushed a strand of dark hair back from her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her cheek, and Anna found herself leaning into that touch before she had quite decided to. "I've been trying not to feel what I feel," Raymond said quietly, his hand still resting against her cheek. "Seemed wrong, somehow, to court a woman while I was drawing wages from her, and her grieving her father besides. But I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending otherwise, Anna. Not when I look at you and feel the way I feel." "And how is it you feel?" Anna asked, though she thought she already knew, could feel the answer in the way her own heart was pounding against her ribs. "Like I've been riding towards something my whole life," Raymond said, "and I only just now realized what it was." He kissed her then, gentle and searching, there beside the dying fire with the herd sleeping peaceful in the dark around them, and Anna kissed him back with 4 months of grief and fear and loneliness pouring out of her all at once, until she was not certain any longer where the sorrow ended and the wanting began, only that she did not wish for it to stop, not for anything in the world. They did not speak of it again, not directly, in the days that followed, though something had shifted between them that neither could pretend away. A warmth in the way Raymond's hand would brush hers passing a coffee cup, a softness in the way Anna's eyes would seek him out across the herd each morning before the day's work began. The cattle drive continued on, day after dusty day, north and east across the rolling plains toward Cheyenne, and if the other hands noticed the change between their trail boss and his employer, they had the good sense, or perhaps simply the exhaustion, not to remark upon it. Trouble found them on the 11th night, exactly as Wallace Sorrel had promised it might. They had made camp in a shallow coulee some 15 miles south of the railhead, close enough now to Cheyenne that Anna had allowed herself, for the first time in days, to imagine the herd delivered safely and the note paid in full. Cookie Malone had cooked up a fine supper of beans and salt pork to celebrate the nearness of their destination, and the mood around the campfire had been lighter than at any point since they had set out, Jed Whitfield even producing a battered harmonica from his saddlebags and playing a few rough tunes while Otis Cray sang along in a voice that was enthusiastic, if not especially tuneful. It was Walks with Thunder, out on first watch, who heard them coming, 3 riders approaching the herd from the darkness beyond the firelight, moving with the particular quiet care of men who did not wish to be heard at all. He gave the alarm in a low, sharp whistle that brought every man in camp instantly and silently to his feet, rifles in hand, the celebratory mood of moments before evaporating into the tense stillness of men who understood exactly what was happening and exactly what was at stake. "Rustlers," Raymond said quietly to Anna, checking the load in his rifle with hands that were steady despite the tightness in his voice. "Probably Sorrel's men come to spook the herd and scatter it before we can deliver it to market. Stay close to the wagon, Anna, and keep your rifle ready, but let us handle the shooting if it comes to that. This is my herd, Raymond, my ranch on the line. I'll not hide behind a wagon while other men fight for it." Raymond looked at her for a long moment in the dim firelight, and whatever argument he might have made died before he spoke it, replaced instead by something that looked almost like pride. "All right," he said simply. "Stay low and stay behind cover, but I understand. Just don't do anything foolish, Anna Bishop. I've come to have a powerful interest in your continued good health." The three riders came on slow through the darkness, and when they were close enough to be seen by the dying light of the campfire, Anna recognized one of them as a man she had seen before, riding at Wallace Sorrel's side the day he had come to threaten her in the corral. "Evening," the lead rider called out, reining up at a distance that was almost but not quite respectful. "Didn't mean to startle you folks, just passing through." "Strange hour to be passing through anyone's camp," Raymond called back, his rifle held loose but ready across his body. "State your business or turn around and ride on." "No business at all," the rider said, though something in his tone suggested otherwise, and Anna saw his eyes moving over the herd, counting, calculating, the way a man might size up a job before attempting it. Just wondering if an outfit this small might welcome some extra hands for the last push to Cheyenne. Dangerous country out here, what with rustlers working the trail and all. "We've got hands enough," Raymond said flatly. "And we've got no need of strangers riding up on our camp in the dark of night. I'll ask you once more, gentlemen, kindly, to turn around and be on your way." There was a long, tense pause, the kind that seemed to stretch the very air thin. 3 armed men against a camp that Anna knew Raymond had made certain looked better defended than it actually was, spreading the hands out along the firelight's edge so their numbers seemed greater than 6. Then, with a low laugh that held no humor in it at all, the lead rider tipped his hat. "No offense meant, friend. We'll be on our way." But as he turned his horse, Anna saw his hand drop toward the pistol at his hip, and in the same instant she saw Raymond's rifle come up, faster than she would have believed a man could move. The sharp crack of a warning shot fired into the air between the riders and the herd, close enough to make all 3 horses shy and dance sideways in the darkness. "Next one won't go over your heads," Raymond called out, his voice hard as flint now, all trace of the gentle man Anna had come to know replaced by something dangerous and sure. "Ride on, and tell Wallace Sorrel that Bishop cattle reach market whole, or he'll answer for every head that doesn't." The 3 riders, faced with a camp clearly ready and willing to defend itself, chose discretion over further provocation, wheeling their horses and disappearing back into the darkness at a hard gallop. The camp remained tense and watchful for the rest of that night, no one sleeping more than in fitful snatches, rifles kept close at hand, but the riders did not return, and by the gray light of dawn the herd was accounted for, every head present, and the crew broke camp with a grim, relieved efficiency and pushed on hard for Cheyenne. They arrived at the railhead 2 days later, dust-caked and exhausted but whole, the herd intact, and the sight of the stockyards and the great iron rails stretching away toward the rising sun brought a lump to Anna's throat that she had not expected. She had done it. Against the bank, against Wallace Sorrel, against every doubt that had gnawed at her through the long nights of the drive, she had brought 312 head of cattle 400 miles across open country to market, and whatever the price turned out to be, she had proven something to herself that no ledger book could ever fully capture. The cattle buyer at the Cheyenne stockyards, a heavy-set man named Gustafson who had been buying beef off the trail for a decade and had an eye for quality stock, walked the length of the herd with a critical squint, checking weight and condition, and named a price that made Anna's heart leap so suddenly she had to steady herself against the corral fence. $9.50 a head Delivered condition considered, Gustafson said. Fine stock, Miss Bishop. Better condition than most that come through this late in the season. You run a tight outfit. Anna did the arithmetic in her head, quick and certain. The numbers she had turned over so many sleepless nights finally resolving into something real. 312 head at $9.50 came to nearly $3,000, more than enough, even after paying the wages owed to her crew, to clear the note at the bank entirely and leave a healthy sum besides for improvements to the ranch breeding stock, whatever repairs the coming winter might demand. Mr. Gustafson, she said, her voice thick with an emotion she could not fully name, you have just saved my father's ranch. Wasn't me that drove 300 head 400 miles through rustler country, ma'am, Gustafson said with a small, respectful nod. That was all you and your crew. I just wrote the check. They celebrated that night in a modest Cheyenne hotel. The whole crew gathered around a table loaded with the finest meal any of them had eaten in weeks, real bread and roasted chicken, and even a bottle of good whiskey that Cookie Malone had been saving for exactly this occasion. Jed Whitfield played his harmonica without any of the tension of that night on the trail, and Otis Cray sang louder and worse than ever, and even Walks with Thunder, usually so quiet and watchful, allowed himself a rare smile as the celebration wore on into the evening. Anna paid every man his full wage that night, plus a bonus from the sale beyond what had been promised, and watched the genuine surprise and gratitude on their faces with a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the whiskey. Cookie Malone, well into his cups by the end of the evening, insisted on standing and offering a toast. To Miss Anna Bishop, he said, raising his glass unsteadily, who's got more sand than any rancher I've rode for in 30 years on the trail, man or woman, and to Raymond Boone besides, who kept us all breathing and this herd together through some mighty tight scrapes. Here's hoping the two of you have the good sense to see what the rest of us have been seeing since about the third day out of Silver Fork. There was general laughter and knowing looks around the table at this, and Anna felt her cheeks burn even as Raymond, seated beside her, laughed along good-naturedly, his hand finding hers beneath the table and holding it there, warm and steady, for the rest of the evening. They rode back toward Silver Fork 3 days later, the crew scattering along the way to whatever work or rest awaited them, Jed and Otis heading south, toward another outfit that had need of hands, Cookie Malone talking of one more season on the trail before he finally settled down somewhere with a good stove and a soft bed, Walks with Thunder riding north, toward his own people with promises to return if Anna ever needed hands again. Only Anna and Raymond continued on together toward the ranch, the bank draft for the sale of the cattle folded safe in Anna's saddlebag, enough money now to clear the note entirely and start fresh. They rode into Silver Fork on the last day of August, 2 days ahead of the bank's deadline, and Elias Crane's face, when Anna laid the money out on his desk in careful stacks of bills, was a study in surprise that he did his best and largely failed to conceal behind his usual mask of banker's composure. "Well," he said, counting the money with visible astonishment. "Well, Miss Bishop, it seems you were as good as your word. I confess I did not expect. That is, I am pleased to see the note satisfied in full." "I told you I would pay it, Mr. Crane," Anna said, watching him mark the ledger with the deep satisfaction of a debt finally closed. "I hope you'll remember, the next time a woman comes to you claiming she can save what's hers, that hope has paid this mortgage just fine." Crane had the grace to look faintly abashed at his own words being returned to him. "I stand corrected, Miss Bishop. Genuinely. The bank is pleased to consider this matter closed, and I wish you and your ranch continued prosperity." He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, as though offering something that cost him more than the words themselves suggested. "For what it is worth, I did not relish the thought of foreclosing on your father's land. Business is business, but I am glad truly that it did not come to that." Anna left the bank that afternoon with the note marked paid in full. the deed to the Bishop Ranch entirely and finally her own, free and clear of any claim but her own hard work and her father's memory. And she stood for a long moment on the boardwalk outside, looking down Main Street at the town her father had watched grow up around his ranch over 17 years, feeling something settle in her chest that she could only describe as peace. Raymond was waiting for her by the horses, and when she told him the note was paid, he let out a whoop of pure joy that turned heads up and down the street, sweeping her up into an embrace that lifted her clean off her feet. And Anna laughed, really laughed, for the first time since her father's death, laughed until there were tears streaming down her face that were, for once, made entirely of relief and joy rather than grief. "We did it," she said, when he finally set her back down, still holding tight to her waist as though he could not quite bring himself to let go. "Raymond, we actually did it." "You did it, Anna Bishop," Raymond corrected her gently. "I just had the good fortune to ride alongside you while you did." They did not go straight back to the ranch that afternoon, but wandered instead down to a small restaurant near the edge of town that served coffee and pie to travelers and townsfolk alike, and sat together at a corner table by the window, watching Silver Fork go about its ordinary business. The boy driving hogs down the center of the street, a woman hanging washing behind the mercantile, two old men arguing amiably outside the saloon about the merits of some horse race long since decided. "What will you do now?" Raymond asked, "with the ranch secure and the note paid? Seems to me you've been so occupied with survival these past months, you've had little time to think on what comes after." Anna considered the question seriously, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands. "Rebuild the herd, I suppose. Buy some breeding stock with what's left from the sale, maybe some better bulls to improve the bloodline. Repair the barn roof before winter. Beyond that." She trailed off, looking at Raymond across the small table, at the warmth in his brown eyes, at the way he was watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster despite the exhaustion of the past weeks. "Beyond that, I suppose it depends on what you intend to do, Raymond Boone. Whether you mean to keep riding on to wherever it is drifting cowboys drift to, or whether you might consider staying a while longer at a ranch that could use a good foreman, and perhaps something more than that besides." Raymond reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing slow circles against her palm in a way that sent warmth radiating up her arm and into her chest. "Anna," he said quietly, "I have been trying to find the right words for this since that night by the Platte River, and I don't believe there's ever going to be a perfectly right time, so I suppose I'll just say it plain, the way you've always seemed to prefer things said. I don't want to be your foreman. I don't want to draw wages from you and sleep in the bunkhouse and pretend that what's grown between us these past months is anything less than what it is. I love you, Anna Bishop. I have loved you, I think, since that first evening on your porch, watching the sun go down and realizing I had never in my life met a woman with such fire in her and such tenderness besides. I want to marry you if you'll have me, and build something with you on that ranch that's bigger than either of us could build alone." Anna felt tears spring to her eyes again, for the second time that day, though these came even more easily than the ones before. "Raymond Boone," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I have been waiting for you to say something like that since roughly the 4th day out of Silver Fork, and I was beginning to think I might have to say it first. Banker's daughter, propriety be damned. Is that a yes, then?" "That is most emphatically a yes." He kissed her there in the small restaurant, in full view of the window and anyone passing on the street outside, and Anna did not care one bit who saw, kissed him back with all the joy and relief and love that had been building in her chest for weeks. And when they finally pulled apart, both of them were laughing, giddy with a happiness that felt, after such a long, dark winter of grief and worry, almost too large to contain. They were married 3 weeks later, on a warm September afternoon, in the small white church at Silver Fork that Anna's father had helped build with his own hands 12 years before. The whole valley seemed to turn out for the ceremony, drawn as much by curiosity about the young rancher who had faced down the bank and Wallace Sorrel both and won, as by genuine affection for Anna and her new husband. Cookie Malone rode 2 days from wherever he had drifted to in order to attend, bringing with him a fine set of silver spurs as a wedding gift that he claimed, with a wink, he had won fair and square in a card game, and had absolutely not stolen from anyone in particular. Jed Whitfield and Otis Cray came too, along with Walks with Thunder, who presented Anna with a beautifully beaded belt made by his own sister, a gift that Anna treasured for the rest of her life. Even Elias Crane attended, standing somewhat stiffly at the back of the church in his best suit, and afterward offered Raymond a handshake and a genuine word of congratulations that suggested the banker, whatever his profession demanded of him, was not entirely without a heart. Wallace Sorrel did not attend, and word reached the valley some months later that he had finally overextended himself trying to buy out one too many small ranches along the creek, taking on debt he could not sustain when a dry summer hurt his own herds badly, and had been forced to sell off a portion of his own land to cover his losses, a small and quiet justice that Anna could not help but feel on hearing the news. Was no less than the man deserved for the years of intimidation he had visited on smaller outfits throughout the valley. The years that followed were not without their hardships, as no life on the frontier ever truly was. There was a brutal winter in 1881 that tested the ranch's resources and Anna and Raymond's resourcefulness both. A summer drought in 1884 that forced them to drive cattle further than usual to find adequate grazing, and the ordinary difficulties of building a life and a livelihood from land that gave generously, but never without cost. But there was also, through all of it, a partnership that grew stronger with each passing season, Anna and Raymond working the ranch side by side in a way that few marriages of that era, built as many were on more practical and less romantic foundations, ever quite achieved. Their first child, a boy they named Thomas after Anna's father, was born in the spring of 1879, arriving squalling and healthy on a night when Raymond had ridden 40 miles to Silver Fork and back to fetch the doctor, arriving back at the ranch with mere minutes to spare before the birth, and collapsing afterward, once mother and child were both declared healthy and strong, into a chair by the fire in an exhaustion so complete that Anna, still weak from labor but laughing with pure joy, teased him for years afterward about which of them had actually done the harder work that night. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah after Raymond's own mother who had passed years before he ever came west, was born 2 years later, in 1881, during that same hard winter, and the difficulty of that season, with snow drifted so high against the ranch house that Raymond had to shovel a path simply to reach the barn each morning, only seemed to deepen the bond of the small growing family, huddled together through the long cold months, emerging into spring thinner and more tired, but closer than ever. A third child followed in 1884, another son they named Walker in honor of Walks with Thunder, who had by then become a regular presence at the ranch during roundup seasons, bringing with him each year news of his own growing family among the Crow, and a friendship between the two families that would last for decades and pass down to their children in turn. The ranch itself grew steadily across those years, the herd rebuilt and then expanded well beyond what Thomas Bishop had ever managed in his own lifetime, additional acreage purchased as opportunities arose, a new and larger barn built in 1883 to replace the old one that had finally, after 20 years of weathering Wyoming winters, begun to show its age beyond what repair could fix. Raymond proved as skilled a rancher as he had been a cowboy, his years of experience across a dozen outfits in Texas and beyond translating into a deep and practical knowledge of breeding, grazing management, and the countless small decisions that separated a thriving ranch from one merely surviving. Anna, for her part, never lost the fierce independence that had first drawn Raymond's admiration on that hot afternoon, when he'd ridden into her yard looking for work, and found instead a woman running an entire ranch alone through sheer stubborn will. She continued to ride and rope alongside her husband and hands well into her 40s, continued to keep the ranch's books with the same careful precision that had once impressed even Elias Crane, and continued, whenever the occasion called for it, to speak her mind plainly and without apology to bankers, buyers, and neighboring ranchers alike. It was Anna, in fact, who in 1889 organized the valley's small ranchers into a cooperative arrangement for sharing the costs of driving cattle to the increasingly distant railheads as the railroad network expanded and market conditions shifted, an arrangement that helped a dozen smaller outfits along Crooked Creek survive lean years that might otherwise have forced them to sell out entirely, much as her own father's ranch had once nearly been forced to sell. She never forgot, in the comfort and security of her own eventual prosperity, what it had felt like to stand in Elias Crane's office with nothing but grief and stubbornness standing between her and losing everything, and she made certain, for the rest of her life, that no other rancher in the valley faced quite so lonely a battle as she once had. Elias Crane himself, in an irony that Anna never tired of pointing out to him over the years at church socials and town gatherings, eventually became one of the strongest advocates within the Silver Fork Trust and Savings Bank for extending patient credit to struggling ranchers rather than rushing toward foreclosure, a shift in policy that he attributed, whenever pressed on the matter, entirely to having once badly underestimated a young woman named Anna Bishop, and having no wish to make quite that particular mistake again. The Bishop Boone Ranch, as it came to be known throughout the valley, celebrated its 20th anniversary of the marriage that had founded it in the autumn of 1898, with all three of Anna and Raymond's children grown or nearly grown, Thomas working alongside his father learning every aspect of the ranch's operation with an easy competence that spoke well of the future. Sarah recently engaged to a young rancher's son from a neighboring spread whose family had, in a nice turn of history, been among those helped by Anna's cooperative arrangement a decade before, and young Walker, barely 17, but already showing the same restless curiosity and love of the open range that had once carried his father up from Texas as a ruthless young cowboy looking for something worth doing. On the evening of that anniversary, Anna and Raymond sat together on the same porch where they had first begun to know each other, 20 years and more before, watching the sun set gold and red behind the Bighorn Mountains exactly as it had that first summer, though the valley around them had changed considerably in the intervening decades, the ranch grown larger and more prosperous than either of them could have imagined that desperate spring of 1878. When Anna had stood in a banker's office and made a vow over her father's fresh grave. "Do you ever think back on it?" Raymond asked, his arm around Anna's shoulders as they watched the light fade, "on that first drive to Cheyenne, and how close it all came to falling apart?" "All the time," Anna admitted, leaning into the familiar warmth of him, the same warmth that had first settled something in her chest 20 years before, sitting beside him under a sky full of stars with the herd sleeping peaceful around them. "I think of it every time I stand in that bank now, and Elias Crane treats me with the respect I had to fight so hard to earn from him. I think of it every time a young rancher comes through the valley looking for work and hears the story of how Anna Bishop faced down Wallace Sorrell and the bank both, and kept her father's ranch standing against every reasonable expectation that she'd fail." "You never did tell me," Raymond said, with a small smile, "whether you truly believed that day in Crane's office that you'd manage it, or whether it was mostly bluster to keep from breaking down entirely in front of the man." Anna considered the question seriously, watching the last light fade behind the mountains, the same mountains that had watched over this land through her father's whole life and now through her own. "I believed it," she said finally. "I don't know how exactly, given how little sense the numbers made at the time, but I stood there over my father's grave and I made that vow, and something in me simply refused to accept any outcome other than keeping it. I suppose that's not much of an answer, but it's the truest one I've got." "It's answer enough," Raymond said, and pulled her closer against his side. "I've watched you keep that vow for 20 years now, Anna Bishop, watched you turn a ranch on the edge of ruin into something that'll stand for generations, God willing, long after you and I are both gone from this earth. I don't know that I've ever loved anything the way I love watching you do exactly what you set your mind to do, against every obstacle a person could put in your way." "We did it together," Anna said softly, turning her face up to look at him, at the lines that 20 years of Wyoming sun and wind had etched into his face, lines that only made him more dear to her rather than less. "You rode into my yard looking for work, Raymond Boone, and you found instead a whole life you never expected. I like to think I got the better end of that particular trade." "I like to think we both did," Raymond said, and kissed her, gentle and sure, there on the porch where it had all begun, with the mountains standing dark and eternal against the fading light, and the ranch spread out around them, alive and thriving and entirely, permanently secure, exactly as Anna had vowed it would be, all those years before, standing alone and grieving in a banker's office with nothing but stubbornness and love of the land to sustain her. The ranch that Thomas Bishop had built with his own 2 hands in 1861 did not die with him, as Anna had promised the banker it would not, nor did it die with Anna and Raymond either, in the fullness of time. It passed instead to their son Thomas, who ran it with his own wife through the turn of the century, and into the new era of automobiles and telephones that would have astonished his grandfather beyond measure. And from Thomas, it passed in turn to his own children, the ranch growing and changing with each generation, but never losing the particular character that Anna Bishop had first given it. Standing in a banker's office in the spring of 1878 with grief in her heart and iron in her spine, refusing absolutely to let go of what her father had built, and finding, in the refusing, a love and a life she had never expected but had, in the end, deserved entirely. Anna Bishop Boone lived to be 81 years old, passing peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1935, in the same ranch house where she had raised her children and buried her father and made her vow to a banker, who had long since become a friend rather than an adversary. Raymond, 3 years older, followed her in death only 18 months later, and those who knew them both said, without much exaggeration, that he had simply not found much reason to go on living once Anna was no longer beside him on that porch each evening to watch the sun go down together, as they had done for nearly 60 years. They were buried together on a small rise overlooking Crooked Creek, within sight of the ranch house and the barn and the wide green pastures that had been the whole of their shared life's work, their headstones simple and unadorned except for their names and the dates of their long lives, and a single line that their children had chosen together, from something Anna had said many times over the years to anyone who asked how she had managed to save a failing ranch against such impossible odds. "The land remembers who loved it." The ranch stands still today, in the hands of Bishop and Boone descendants who have never forgotten the story of how it was nearly lost, and how it came, instead, to be saved, by a woman's fierce love for what her father built, and a drifting cowboy's decision to stay and help her build it into something even greater than either of them had dared to imagine, on an ordinary afternoon in the spring of 1878. When Raymond Boone rode into Anna Bishop's yard looking for nothing more than honest work, and found, instead, the whole of his life waiting for him in her steady gray eyes.